transformations that we've talked about previously can also be applied to exponential functions. So if we want to graph f of x equals 2 to the x minus 1. Now we know from the previous video that the graph of just 2 to the x has a point at negative 1, 1/2, 0, 1, and 1, 2, and it looks something like this. Now that minus 1 that comes after the x tells me, for my transformations, to shift everything to the right 1. So I'm going to take all of the points that were on my original graph of 2 to the x and move them to the right 1. So that will give me the point 0, 1/2, 1, 1, and 2, 2. And then I connect my new points, and there I have the graph of 2 to the x minus 1. In the last video, we also graphed 1/3 to the x. That contained the points negative 1, 3, 0, 1, and 1, 1/3, and looked like this. Now our transformations tell us that having a negative out in front of the function means we want to flip over the x-axis, which means this point at positive 3 gets flipped down to negative 3. Point at positive 1 gets flipped down to negative 1, and the point at positive 1/3 gets flipped down to negative 1/3. And then connecting those points gives me a graph that looks like that. So if I want to graph h of x equals 1 minus 4 to the x plus 2, I'm going to start with my base function of just 4 to the x and figure out what that looks like. So when I plug in negative 1 in place of this x, 4 to the negative 1 is the same as 1/4. 4 to the 0 is 1, and 4 to the 1 is 4. So plotting those 3 points, we end up with a graph that looks like this. And I'm just going to take this h of x and rewrite it a little bit so that it's in the order that we're used to looking at our functions. I'm going to put the negative 4 to the x plus 2 first, and then this plus 1, positive 1, on the end. So now, taking care of my transformations in order from left to right, this negative tells us to flip over the x-axis. So that's going to bring this point down to negative 1/4. This point gets flipped over to negative 1, and this point gets flipped over to negative 4. So at this point, we have something that looks like this. And then the plus 2 on the inside with the x tells us to move everything to the left 2, and the plus 1 on the end of my function tells us to shift all of our points up 1. So I'm going to take the points from my last graph and shift them all left 2, up 1. So this point is going to go left 2, up 1, which means it ends up at negative 3, 3/4. This one goes left 2, up 1, which puts it at negative 2, 0. And this one goes left 2, up 1, putting it at negative 1, negative 3. And then I connect those. And there is my final graph of h of x.